The cameras found Damien Moretti long before the federal agents did. By the time the black SUVs rolled to a stop outside the Manhattan courthouse, every major news network had already interrupted its morning programming, broadcasting live as America's most feared businessman stepped out of his armored sedan wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his expression unreadable beneath the flashing lights. To millions watching from living rooms and office break rooms, he looked exactly like the man the headlines had been describing for weeks, a ruthless mafia boss finally cornered by justice. To the handful of people who truly knew him, he looked like someone carrying a burden far heavier than the silver handcuffs waiting only a few yards away. Damien paused at the bottom of the courthouse steps, straightened the cuff of his jacket, and glanced across the sea of microphones and shouting reporters. He wasn't searching for an escape. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was looking for one person. Rachel Hayes stood behind the police barricade with the other journalists, a press badge hanging from her neck and a leather satchel resting against her side. Unlike everyone around her, she wasn't shouting questions. She wasn't holding out a microphone. She wasn't trying to capture the perfect headline. Her fingers remained wrapped tightly around a small black flash drive hidden inside her coat pocket. It was so small that no television camera could have noticed it, yet it weighed more heavily than anything she had ever carried. Inside that tiny piece of plastic was enough evidence to dismantle the government's entire case against Damien Moretti. One upload, one public release, 1 minute. That was all it would take. The crowd roared as federal agents approached him. Reporters shouted accusations over one another. "Mr. Moretti, did you order Senator Collins' assassination? Did your foundation launder campaign money? Are you finally admitting your connections to organized crime?" Damien answered none of them. His eyes never left Rachel. For one suspended moment, the noise faded into nothing. Their marriage had survived angry board meetings, political attacks, death threats, and years of public scrutiny. Yet now the only conversation that mattered passed silently between two pairs of exhausted eyes. Rachel knew exactly what he was asking without him saying a single word. Release it. End this. Tell them the truth. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs as she tightened her grip on the flash drive. She imagined plugging it into the nearest camera crew's laptop. She imagined every news station in America broadcasting the files before sunset. She imagined Damien walking free before dinner. And then she imagined 12 families receiving phone calls that would tell them the people hidden under witness protection had just been exposed to the men hunting them. She closed her eyes for half a second. When she opened them again, Damien was still waiting. His face remained calm, but she recognized the faint crease near his left eye, the one that only appeared when he was afraid. No one else would have noticed it. She had memorized every version of his silence over the years. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rachel shook her head. Not now. Damien held her gaze for another long second before giving the smallest nod. There was no anger, no accusation, only disappointment wrapped in acceptance. The agent stepped forward. One reached for his wrist. Metal clicked against skin. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Flashbulbs exploded across the courthouse steps, as if lightning had struck the city in broad daylight. Television anchors spoke over the images with dramatic urgency, announcing that the government had finally arrested the billionaire philanthropist, long suspected of hiding a criminal empire beneath legitimate businesses. None of them knew the evidence already existed to destroy every accusation being spoken into their microphones. None of them knew Rachel Hayes was carrying it only a few feet away. "Mrs. Hayes," another reporter called as Damien was escorted toward the courthouse entrance. "You've investigated political corruption for years. Do you believe your husband is guilty?" Rachel stared at the questioner for several seconds before answering quietly. "I believe the truth deserves to survive long enough to be told correctly." The response confused everyone. Within minutes it spread across social media, dissected by commentators who argued she had refused to defend her own husband. Some claimed she was protecting her career. Others insisted their marriage had secretly fallen apart months earlier. Online headlines multiplied faster than anyone could read them. Rachel ignored every notification vibrating inside her purse. She watched Damien disappear through the courthouse doors without looking back. Only after the heavy wooden doors closed did she finally allow herself to breathe. Her editor appeared beside her, lowering his camera. "You could have ended this today," he whispered. Rachel looked down at the hidden flash drive resting in her palm. "No," she answered. "I could have started something much worse." Before he could ask another question, she slipped the drive back into her pocket and walked away from the courthouse while hundreds of reporters rushed toward the opposite entrance, chasing breaking news that was only half true. The city moved around her with its usual, relentless rhythm. Yellow taxis weaving through traffic, pedestrians staring at their phones, sirens echoing between glass towers. But Rachel barely noticed any of it. Every step felt heavier than the last. She remembered the first time Damien had ever taken her hand years ago, not at a glamorous gala or a charity dinner, but inside a tiny neighborhood bookstore where neither of them expected to be recognized. He had smiled at her over a stack of history books and confessed he envied ordinary people because they could make mistakes without seeing them printed on the front page. The next morning, she had laughed then. Neither of them realized how prophetic those words would become. Her phone rang. An unknown number, she answered without speaking. A frightened male voice whispered only one sentence before disconnecting. "They're watching the witnesses already." Rachel stood frozen on the crowded sidewalk, the call ending as abruptly as it had begun. Across town, Damien was being photographed, fingerprinted, and processed into federal custody, while television networks celebrated the biggest arrest of the decade. Yet somewhere beyond the cameras, someone already knew the evidence still existed. Someone knew Rachel hadn't destroyed it. And if that person was watching the witnesses, then the countdown had already begun, not toward Damien's freedom, but toward a choice that could cost innocent lives before the truth ever reached a courtroom. 7 years before federal agents placed Damien Moretti in handcuffs on live television, no one would have imagined that the most feared surname in New York would become attached to one of the country's most respected investigative reporters. Their first meeting had not happened during a scandal, a political fundraiser, or a glamorous charity gala. It had happened inside a quiet public library on a rainy Thursday afternoon, where Damien had slipped away from an exhausting board meeting to search for a rare history book his late mother used to read, while Rachel Hayes sat alone at a wooden table surrounded by stacks of documents for an investigation exposing corruption in the city's housing authority. Neither of them recognized the other immediately. Damien had left his security team outside to enjoy a few precious minutes of anonymity, wearing a simple navy overcoat instead of the tailored suits that usually announced his presence before he entered a room. Rachel barely glanced up when he accidentally reached for the same book she had just pulled from the shelf. She smiled politely, stepped back, and insisted he take it first because she could wait. It was such a small act of kindness that Damien almost forgot it before he reached the checkout desk. Yet later that evening, he found himself thinking about the woman who had treated him like an ordinary stranger instead of a powerful man whose name usually inspired fear, admiration, or suspicion. A week later, they crossed paths again at a neighborhood coffee shop, where Rachel was interviewing a retired city engineer, and Damien was quietly reviewing redevelopment plans for one of his charitable housing projects. She recognized him this time, not because of his wealth, but because she had spent years investigating the influence of powerful families across New York. Instead of confronting him with difficult questions, she simply introduced herself and admitted that she had expected him to be very different. Damien raised an eyebrow. Different how? Rachel hesitated before answering honestly. Louder, he laughed, surprising both of them. It was the first genuine laugh he had shared with anyone outside his closest circle in months. Their conversations grew naturally after that, never forced, never dramatic. They debated history, architecture, music, and journalism over late-night dinners where neither tried to impress the other. Rachel challenged Damien in ways his executives never dared. She questioned decisions everyone else praised, refused expensive gifts without embarrassment, and reminded him that respect earned through fear disappeared the moment fear itself vanished. Damien found himself listening instead of arguing. For a man accustomed to controlling every negotiation, it felt strangely comforting to surrender the final word. Months passed before either acknowledged that friendship had quietly become love. The relationship remained hidden, not because they were ashamed, but because both understood the consequences of public attention. Rachel's credibility as a journalist would be questioned if the world discovered she was dating the head of the Moretti family, while Damien knew every rival searching for leverage would immediately see Rachel as his greatest vulnerability. Their evenings became carefully protected moments stolen from lives that demanded constant performance. Sometimes they walked anonymously through neighborhoods where no one expected to see them. Sometimes Rachel cooked simple dinners in her apartment while Damien insisted on washing every dish afterward, despite never having learned how to load a dishwasher properly. Those ordinary moments became more valuable than every luxury either of them possessed. When Damien finally proposed, there were no photographers, no diamond display beneath chandeliers, and no orchestra waiting to perform. He simply placed a modest ring on the table between 2 cups of coffee inside the same little cafe where they had spent countless evenings talking about everything except themselves. "If you say no," he said softly, "I'll still come here every Thursday." Rachel smiled through unexpected tears. "Then I'd better say yes before someone steals our table." They married quietly several weeks later in a small chapel outside the city, with only Father Gabriel and 2 witnesses present. There were no headlines announcing the wedding, no celebrity guests, no lavish reception. Rachel insisted that the happiest day of her life should belong only to the people living it, not to strangers consuming it. For a while, life settled into a rhythm neither had believed possible. Damien expanded legitimate businesses and charitable foundations while steadily reducing every remaining connection to the violent legacy left behind by earlier generations of his family. Rachel continued exposing political corruption regardless of whose reputation suffered, and Damien never once asked her to soften a story involving people connected to his name. Their unspoken agreement was simple. She would never compromise the truth for him. He would never ask her to. That promise became the strongest foundation of their marriage. Yet as Damien's influence grew, so did the number of enemies who could no longer attack him directly. Anonymous articles began questioning Rachel's objectivity. Politicians suggested she received privileged information through her husband. Invitations disappeared from journalism conferences she had attended for years. Editors quietly warned her that public perception mattered as much as facts. She accepted every consequence without complaint, believing integrity always required sacrifice. Damien noticed the attacks but underestimated their weight. Each time Rachel dismissed another cruel headline with a tired smile, he convinced himself she was stronger than the people writing them. He failed to recognize that strength did not mean immunity. One evening, after another exhausting day, Rachel returned home carrying grocery bags, while Damien sat alone in the library, studying legal documents related to an upcoming Senate investigation. She watched him for several seconds before asking, "Will you still be working when dinner's ready?" Without looking up from the papers, he answered automatically, "Just give me 10 minutes." 10 minutes became an hour. Dinner grew cold. Rachel quietly packed the untouched food into containers, leaving one plate covered on the kitchen counter before heading upstairs. Damien finally entered the dining room nearly 2 hours later, apologizing to an empty chair. He smiled sadly, reheated the meal she had prepared, and promised himself he would make time tomorrow. Neither of them realized that tomorrow would never arrive the way they expected, because less than 48 hours later, Rachel's newest investigation would uncover a secret buried deep inside the office of Senator Richard Collins, a discovery that would place her marriage, Damien's freedom, and countless innocent lives on a collision course from which none of them could quietly walk away. Rachel had investigated powerful people before, but Senator Richard Collins was different. The deeper she dug into his financial records, campaign donations, and private meetings, the more often perfectly ordinary documents seemed to disappear just before she could obtain certified copies. Sources who had eagerly agreed to speak with her suddenly canceled interviews without explanation. One longtime government accountant resigned only days before their scheduled meeting and left the country without telling his closest colleagues. Even Rachel's editor, a man who had spent 3 decades defending aggressive investigative journalism, quietly advised her to slow down until they understood who else might be connected to the story. Rachel thanked him, then continued working exactly as before. She had built her career on one simple belief: truth rarely became less dangerous by waiting. Across the city, Damien noticed the change almost immediately. Rachel no longer left notebooks lying open on the kitchen table. She locked her laptop before walking away, answered unfamiliar phone calls in another room, and occasionally stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence whenever an unknown car remained parked outside their townhouse for too long. None of those habits frightened Damien nearly as much as the expression she wore each evening when she believed he wasn't looking. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. She was measuring risks she refused to describe. One night, long after midnight, Damien found her standing alone on the apartment balcony, watching rain collect on the empty streets below. He wrapped a coat around her shoulders without saying anything. She leaned gently against him, grateful for the silence before finally whispering, "Have you ever wished you didn't know something?" Damien looked toward the city lights stretching across the skyline. "Every day." Rachel nodded slowly. "I'm starting to understand why people bury the truth." Damien turned toward her. "Whatever you found, you don't have to carry it alone." She smiled, but the sadness behind it remained. "I wish it were that simple." Before he could ask another question, her phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed only a blocked number. Rachel answered carefully. She listened for less than 20 seconds before ending the call without speaking a single word. "Who was that?" Damien asked. Rachel slipped the phone into her pocket. "Someone who wants me to stop asking questions." Damien's expression hardened. "Then I'll make sure they never call again." Rachel immediately shook her head. "No, if they know you're involved, they'll disappear before I can prove anything." Damien hated the answer because he knew she was right. He had spent his entire life solving problems by confronting them directly. But journalism followed different rules. Evidence had to survive scrutiny. Witnesses had to remain alive. Timing often mattered more than certainty. He reluctantly stepped back, trusting Rachel's judgment even while every instinct urged him to intervene. Over the following weeks, the invisible pressure intensified. Rachel noticed unfamiliar faces sitting in the same cafe every morning. Anonymous emails accused her of fabricating evidence. A black sedan appeared outside the newsroom almost every evening before vanishing when police patrols approached. Yet the most disturbing moment came inside the newspaper archive, where an elderly records clerk quietly slipped a folded note between the pages of an old newspaper before pretending nothing had happened. Rachel waited until she returned to her office before opening it. There were only 7 handwritten words. Asterisk, "You're investigating the wrong man. Follow Sloan instead." She read the sentence 3 times. Victor Sloan, the state's ambitious attorney general. The prosecutor leading the investigation against Damien's business empire, publicly celebrated as a relentless champion against corruption. Rachel had interviewed him twice over the years. Calm, polished, convincing. If the note were true, the entire investigation surrounding Senator Collins might be built on a lie carefully hidden behind another lie. That evening, she told Damien only part of the truth. "I think this story is bigger than I expected." Damien studied her carefully. "Does it involve me?" Rachel hesitated for the first time since they had met. "Maybe." The single word lingered between them, longer than any argument ever could. Damien reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his own. "Promise me something." "What?" "If this investigation ever forces you to choose between your story and your safety." Rachel looked into his eyes. "Choose yourself." She lowered her gaze before answering softly. "I don't know if I'll have that choice." 3 days later, Rachel finally met the anonymous source who had sent the note. They arranged to speak beneath the elevated train tracks in Brooklyn just before sunrise, where the constant rumble of passing trains made electronic surveillance difficult. The man never gave his name. He wore a baseball cap pulled low across his face and kept checking the empty street behind him. His hands trembled as he handed Rachel a sealed envelope. "Everything you need starts here," he whispered. "But if anyone learns I talked to you," he couldn't finish the sentence. Rachel accepted the envelope without opening it. "Why are you trusting me?" The man gave a tired smile. "Because everyone else is already compromised." Before Rachel could ask another question, headlights appeared at the far end of the street, the source's face drained of color. "They're early," he muttered. He turned and disappeared into a narrow alley without looking back, leaving Rachel standing alone with the envelope clutched tightly against her chest. Inside were dozens of copied financial records, internal government memoranda, and a single flash drive labeled only with today's date. She had no idea that the files hidden inside that tiny device would eventually become the evidence capable of saving her husband's life, or the reason she would one day refuse to save him in front of the entire nation. Rachel did not open the flash drive until she was alone in the newspaper's secure archive room. a windowless space lined with steel cabinets and decades of investigative files that smelled faintly of old paper and printer ink. She locked the door behind her, disconnected the office computer from every network, and inserted the drive into an isolated laptop used only for reviewing sensitive evidence. At first, nothing seemed extraordinary. Financial statements, internal emails, expense reports, court filings. Then she opened a folder marked with a date from nearly 2 years earlier. Her breathing slowed. The folder contained surveillance photographs, confidential witness relocation records, encrypted communications between federal investigators, and a series of internal memoranda stamped with security classifications no journalist should ever possess. Rachel carefully read every page, making handwritten notes instead of digital copies. The deeper she went, the more disturbing the picture became. Senator Richard Collins had indeed uncovered a massive corruption network before his death, but the evidence revealed something even more dangerous. Someone inside the Attorney General's office had secretly redirected federal resources to protect political allies while sacrificing innocent informants whenever it became convenient. The witnesses listed in those files were not criminals bargaining for lighter sentences. Many were accountants, assistants, clerks, drivers, and ordinary employees who had risked everything to expose corruption. They had accepted new identities, new homes, and new lives under government protection. Their locations were scattered throughout the files with frightening precision. Rachel stared at the screen for several long moments before closing her eyes. If those documents became public exactly as they were, Damien would almost certainly be cleared. The prosecution's entire narrative depended upon evidence that these files completely dismantled. But the release would also expose every protected witness whose testimony had not yet reached court. Their names, addresses, photographs, children's schools, emergency contacts, and relocation histories were all there. It wasn't simply dangerous, it was catastrophic. Rachel leaned back in her chair, suddenly aware that her hands were shaking. For the first time in her career, the truth itself had become a weapon. Publishing it immediately would satisfy every journalistic instinct she possessed. It would also sign death warrants for people who had trusted the justice system to keep them alive. Late that evening, she carried the flash drive home without mentioning it to anyone, not even her editor. Damien was waiting in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to his forearms, unsuccessfully attempting to prepare dinner. A pan of overcooked pasta sat abandoned on the stove while tomato sauce bubbled dangerously close to overflowing. Rachel couldn't help smiling, despite the exhaustion pressing against her shoulders. Damien looked up with an embarrassed grin. "I think I may have declared war on Italian cuisine?" She laughed softly, the sound filling the room with a warmth neither of them had felt in weeks. Together they salvaged what they could, eating an imperfect meal at the small wooden table where so many ordinary evenings had quietly become precious memories. Damien noticed the silence returning between them. "You found something today," he said gently. Rachel lowered her fork. "Yes, can you tell me?" She looked toward the window before answering. "Not yet." Damien accepted the answer more easily than most people would have. Trust had always been the foundation of their marriage. Rachel had never lied to him, and he had never demanded access to confidential sources or unpublished investigations. Tonight, however, the distance felt different. It wasn't secrecy born from professional ethics alone. It was the weight of impossible responsibility. After dinner, Rachel remained downstairs while Damien retreated to his study to review documents for an upcoming board meeting. She removed the flash drive from her coat pocket and placed it on the dining table beneath the soft glow of a single pendant light. Such an ordinary object, so impossibly destructive. Her phone vibrated. The caller displayed her editor's private number. "Tell me you have something," he said without greeting. Rachel hesitated. "I have enough to destroy the prosecution." There was a long silence. "Then why don't you sound relieved?" She looked at the flash drive. "Because if I release it tomorrow, innocent people will die." Another silence followed, heavier than the first. Her editor finally spoke in a voice she had rarely heard during 30 years of journalism. "Then you don't have a journalism problem anymore." Rachel closed her eyes. "What do I have? A moral one." The next morning she requested a confidential meeting with the federal judge assigned to the Collins case, hoping there might be a legal pathway to protect the witnesses before exposing the evidence. The request was quietly denied within hours without explanation. That afternoon, another anonymous envelope arrived at the newsroom, There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed one of the protected witnesses walking his young daughter into an elementary school only 2 days earlier. Written across the back in black ink were 5 chilling words. Asterisks, we know where they live. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. Whoever had mailed the photograph wasn't threatening her. They were proving something. The witnesses were already being watched. She immediately locked the photograph inside her desk and drove home earlier than usual, arriving just as Damien stepped out of a meeting with 2 senior executives. He smiled the moment he saw her, but the smile faded when he noticed the fear she could no longer hide. Rachel, what happened? She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to place the flash drive in his hands, explain every name, every file, every impossible choice, and ask him what she should do. Instead, she walked into his arms without saying a word. Damien held her tightly, sensing that something far beyond politics had entered their lives. Neither of them noticed the dark sedan parked across the street. Inside, a man lifted a camera, took 3 photographs through the windshield, and quietly made a phone call. "It's confirmed," he said. "She has the drive." Then the line went dead. The photographs taken from the sedan reached Victor Sloan before sunrise. He studied them in silence from his office overlooking the Capitol, lingering not on Damien Moretti's face but on Rachel's. Experience had taught him that powerful men could withstand public attacks far longer than people who still believed in principles. Rachel Hayes was dangerous because she trusted the law enough to try saving it instead of destroying it. That made her predictable. She would search for the legal path first. She would hesitate before exposing innocent lives. She would carry the burden alone for as long as she could. Victor quietly closed the folder and instructed his chief of staff to accelerate the prosecution. "File the final indictment today," he said. "No delays." Across New York, Rachel barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the photograph of the little girl walking toward her elementary school, unaware that strangers already knew her name. Before leaving home that morning, she copied none of the files, uploaded nothing to the cloud, and refused to tell her editor where the original flash drive would be hidden. She wrapped it inside plain brown paper, sealed it in a waterproof envelope, and locked it inside a private safety deposit box registered under a legal trust established years earlier for confidential source materials. Even Damien didn't know the trust existed. She believed that if she alone carried the secret, no one else could be forced to reveal it. By noon, television stations interrupted regular programming. Federal prosecutors announced sweeping charges against Damien Moretti, accusing him of orchestrating Senator Collins' murder through an elaborate network of shell companies and intermediaries. The evidence sounded overwhelming when presented in carefully edited fragments. Anonymous witnesses, financial transfers, private meetings, suspicious phone records. Rachel recognized several exhibits immediately. Some had been manipulated. Others had been stripped of crucial context. She watched the press conference from her newsroom, her stomach tightening with every sentence. Damien never called to defend himself publicly. He simply surrendered through his attorneys, insisting he would cooperate completely. That decision surprised everyone except Rachel. She knew he had learned long ago that panic only strengthened a false narrative. Still, cooperation could not protect him from headlines already declaring him guilty. By evening, helicopters circled above the federal courthouse as Damien voluntarily arrived to face arraignment. Rachel stood far from the cameras this time, choosing a quiet hallway inside the building instead of the crowded entrance outside. When deputies finally escorted Damien past the holding corridor, he stopped the moment he saw her. For several seconds, neither spoke. The fluorescent lights cast pale shadows across the concrete walls, making the entire building feel colder than winter. Damien managed a tired smile. "You look like you haven't slept." Rachel almost laughed at the understatement. "Neither have you." He glanced toward the deputy, waiting several feet away before lowering his voice. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." Rachel nodded. "Do you have evidence that can clear me?" The question arrived without accusation, without desperation, spoken with the calm certainty of a husband who trusted his wife more than he trusted the system surrounding them. Rachel felt every carefully constructed wall inside her begin to crack. She could have lied. She never had. "Yes," she whispered. Damien closed his eyes for a brief moment, relief washing across his face. "Then why aren't you using it?" Rachel looked directly at him, refusing to hide behind vague explanations. Because the files identify 12 protected families. If I release them now, they won't survive long enough to testify. Damien stared at her as though trying to reconcile two impossible realities. Freedom stood within reach, yet claiming it would condemn people he had never met. The silence stretched between them until he finally asked the only question that mattered. Are you certain? Rachel answered without hesitation. I've checked every document 3 times. Damien slowly lowered his head. The deputy shifted impatiently, signaling that time was over. Rachel reached instinctively toward Damien before stopping herself. Public hallways had eyes everywhere. I'm trying to find another way, she said softly. Damien looked back at her, and for the first time since their marriage began, she saw complete helplessness in the eyes of the man who always found solutions. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was small, almost invisible, but genuine. If the choice is my freedom or 12 innocent families, he paused, swallowing hard. Then you already know which one I'll choose. Rachel felt tears threaten the composure she had fought to preserve for days. I'm sorry, Damien shook his head. Don't apologize for protecting people who trusted the truth. The deputy stepped forward and guided him toward the secure elevator. Damien never looked back, perhaps because he knew if he did, neither of them would have the strength to walk away. The elevator doors closed with a quiet metallic thud that echoed down the empty corridor long after he disappeared. Rachel remained standing there until her phone vibrated. It was her editor. His voice was unusually tense. Rachel, you need to come back immediately. What happened? There was a long pause before he answered. Someone broke into your office. Rachel's heartbeat quickened. Was anything taken? No. Another pause. That's the problem. They didn't steal anything. They left something for you. 20 minutes later, she unlocked her office door and found the room exactly as she had left it. The computer remained untouched. Every file was neatly stacked. Nothing appeared disturbed except for a single white envelope resting in the center of her desk. There was no stamp, no handwriting, no fingerprints visible on its smooth surface. Inside lay only one folded sheet of paper bearing a short typed message. Asterisk, you still think this is about protecting witnesses? It isn't. Ask yourself who wanted Damien arrested before the investigation was finished. Rachel read the anonymous message 3 times before carefully placing it back inside the envelope. Whoever had entered her office had crossed multiple layers of newsroom security without stealing a single document, touching a single computer, or leaving behind any obvious trace except 8 carefully chosen words that shifted the entire direction of her investigation. Until that moment, she had believed the central question was how to protect 12 innocent families while proving Damien's innocence. Now another possibility emerged, one even more unsettling than the evidence locked inside the safety deposit box. What if Damien had never been the true objective? What if someone needed him arrested quickly enough that no one would notice a much larger operation unfolding behind the headlines? Rachel immediately requested access to every public filing connected to the prosecution. Most of the documents had already passed through her hands during previous reporting. But this time she ignored witness statements and financial records. Instead, she focused on dates, filing dates, approval dates, search warrants, judicial signatures, internal memoranda. She covered an entire conference room wall with printed timelines connected by colored strings and handwritten notes, searching not for what had happened, but for when it had happened. Hours passed before she noticed the first inconsistency. A subpoena authorizing investigators to seize business records from one of Damien's companies had been signed almost 2 weeks before Senator Collins was murdered. That alone was unusual. Even more troubling, the supporting affidavit referenced financial transactions that supposedly had not been discovered until several days after the murder itself. Rachel frowned, checking the timestamps again. The sequence was impossible. Someone had prepared legal paperwork before the crime occurred, then later inserted evidence into an already existing investigation. She marked the document with a red circle. A second inconsistency appeared inside a sealed procedural motion that only became public after Damien's arrest. The motion cited testimony from a confidential witness whose official interview had allegedly taken place on a Monday afternoon. Yet Rachel found an earlier transportation log proving that same witness had already entered federal protective custody the previous Friday under a completely different case number. Again, the timeline refused to make sense. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion giving way to cautious excitement. Fabricated evidence often looked convincing when examined individually. It became fragile when placed beside the calendar. Late that evening, Rachel drove to visit her former editor, Thomas Whitaker, who had retired the previous year after 4 decades of investigative journalism. His modest apartment overlooked the Hudson River, its shelves crowded with dusty binders, framed newspaper front pages, and handwritten notebooks accumulated across an extraordinary career. Thomas listened quietly while Rachel explained every inconsistency she had uncovered. When she finally finished, he poured 2 cups of coffee before asking only one question. Who benefits if Damien Moretti stays behind bars for 6 months? Rachel considered the obvious answers first. Political rivals, business competitors, prosecutors seeking publicity. Thomas slowly shook his head. Think bigger. Rachel stared out the apartment window as the city lights reflected across the dark water. 6 months. That was long enough for board members to replace executives, investors to abandon projects, contracts to collapse, and charitable foundations to lose public support. It was long enough for someone to dismantle an entire financial empire without ever proving Damien guilty in court. Thomas nodded as though reading her thoughts. Sometimes prison is the punishment. Sometimes it's only the distraction. Before Rachel left, the retired editor handed her a small leather notebook. I kept this after my last investigation, he said. Never thought I'd need it again. Inside were handwritten names of federal clerks, retired judges, archivists, and court administrators who had quietly helped journalists verify official records over the years. Start with Margaret Ellis, Thomas advised. She remembers every document that ever passed through the Southern District Courthouse. The following morning, Rachel found Margaret working in a quiet basement archive beneath the federal courthouse, surrounded by shelves filled with decades of legal records awaiting digitization. The elderly archivist recognized Rachel immediately and smiled warmly before lowering her voice. You wouldn't be here unless something was terribly wrong. Rachel explained she was trying to verify filing histories rather than case details. Margaret disappeared into the storage room for nearly 20 minutes before returning with several original docket books rarely requested by anyone outside the court system. Together they compared handwritten entries against the electronic records now available to the public. Rachel's pulse quickened. 2 filing numbers had been altered after the originals were logged. The electronic system reflected revised submission dates, but the handwritten registry preserved the truth. Someone with administrative access had quietly rewritten the timeline. Margaret removed her glasses and sighed. Electronic records can be changed. Ink is much more stubborn. Rachel photographed nothing. She simply copied every entry into her notebook exactly as it appeared. As she prepared to leave, Margaret hesitated before opening one final ledger. Folded between its pages rested an old visitor log listing everyone who had accessed restricted filing rooms during the week before Senator Collins' death. Most names belonged to clerks and judges. One did not. Rachel froze as she read it. The signature belonged to Victor Sloan. According to his own public schedule, he had been delivering a televised speech in Washington. At the exact same time, the log placed him inside the federal courthouse in New York. Someone had lied about where he was. Or someone had falsified an official government record. Rachel carefully closed the ledger, thanked Margaret, and hurried toward the courthouse exit with fresh determination. She had finally found the first crack in Victor Sloan's perfect public image. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her phone vibrated with an encrypted message from the anonymous source who had first given her the flash drive. It contained only one sentence. Asterisk. Don't verify the visitor log. They're waiting for you to do exactly that. Rachel stopped walking the moment she read the encrypted message. The busy sidewalk outside the courthouse blurred into meaningless movement as one terrifying possibility settled over her. If someone expected her to verify the visitor log, then the log itself might already be compromised. She slipped her phone back into her pocket without responding and continued walking at a steady pace, resisting every instinct to look over her shoulder. Years of investigative reporting had taught her that panic often revealed more than words. She crossed 2 intersections, entered a crowded bookstore through the front entrance, and quietly exited through a rear service door before taking a taxi to an entirely different part of Manhattan. Only then did she allow herself to think. The anonymous source had never once tried to mislead her. Every warning had protected either evidence or innocent lives. If he was telling her not to rely on the visitor log, then the truth had to exist somewhere deeper, somewhere Victor Sloan believed no one would ever search. That evening, Rachel returned to Thomas Whittaker's apartment carrying nothing but her notebook. She explained the warning, the altered filing dates, and Victor's impossible schedule. Thomas listened carefully before opening an old filing cabinet that had not been touched in years. "Every investigation leaves a shadow," he said quietly. "Official records tell you what happened. Forgotten records tell you what someone wanted erased." From the bottom drawer he removed a thick binder labeled simply *Media Pool Access. Before major political events, journalists were required to register camera positions, interview requests, transportation arrangements, and security checkpoints. Most reporters ignored the paperwork after publication. Thomas never had. Together they searched through archived media credentials from the week of Victor Sloan's televised speech in Washington. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Victor had indeed appeared on national television that afternoon, but the live broadcast had begun almost 2 hours later than the courthouse visitor log suggested. More importantly, the media schedule revealed something no official calendar mentioned. Victor's flight from New York to Washington had departed only 43 minutes after the courthouse entry was recorded. It was physically possible. Barely. The carefully crafted public schedule had simply hidden the trip. Rachel felt the pieces beginning to align. Victor had been in New York. The visitor log itself was authentic. The deception had been built around his public image, not the courthouse records. Still, being present proved nothing. She needed evidence connecting him directly to the conspiracy. The breakthrough arrived unexpectedly from someone who had never intended to become a hero. Late the next morning, Margaret Ellis called Rachel using a payphone instead of her personal cell. Her normally steady voice trembled. "Someone requested the original docket books an hour after you left yesterday," she whispered. "They said they were conducting an internal audit." Rachel immediately understood. Were they federal investigators? No. Margaret paused. One of them introduced himself as a consultant. "Did you recognize him?" Another pause. "I've seen him before." Standing behind Victor Sloan during press conferences, Rachel asked Margaret to leave the courthouse immediately and go somewhere public. Then she contacted Noah Grant, a former federal investigator who had quietly assisted several of her previous investigations after retiring from government service. Noah arrived carrying a worn messenger bag and the cautious expression of a man who trusted evidence more than instincts. Rachel laid every document, timeline, and handwritten note across his dining table. He spent nearly an hour saying almost nothing. Finally, he picked up one internal memorandum from the flash drive and placed it beside a transportation manifest Rachel had copied from the courthouse archives. "These weren't created by the same office," he observed. Rachel frowned. "They're both stamped by the Attorney General's office." Noah nodded. "The stamps are identical. The formatting isn't." He pointed toward tiny differences in margin spacing, document numbering, and metadata references invisible to anyone without years of investigative experience. Someone inserted replacement documents into an authentic case file. Rachel's heartbeat quickened. "Can you prove it?" Noah smiled faintly. "Not yet, but whoever forged these papers forgot one thing." He opened his laptop and accessed a government archive containing historical document templates used by federal agencies. Every office updated formatting standards periodically, often without anyone noticing. Noah compared the questioned memoranda against archive templates year by year, before quietly turning the screen toward Rachel. The documents accusing Damien had supposedly been created in February. Their formatting standard had not been adopted until September, 7 months later. Silence filled the room. Rachel stared at the screen, realizing the implication was devastating. The evidence underpinning Damien's prosecution had been manufactured after the investigation was already underway. Not all of it, just enough to redirect blame. Noah leaned back slowly. "Now we know how they framed him." Rachel looked toward the flash drive resting on the table. "That's still not enough to clear him without exposing the witnesses." Noah nodded. "Then we don't release the files." She looked at him in surprise. "What?" "We separate the evidence." He began organizing documents into different stacks. The witness identities stay protected. The forged memoranda become public. The original financial records go directly to the judge under seal. The relocation files never leave federal custody. Rachel felt hope for the first time since Damien's arrest. There had always been another path. She had simply been too overwhelmed to see it. The truth did not have to arrive all at once. It only had to arrive in the right order. That evening, she requested an emergency sealed hearing through a federal judge known for protecting whistleblowers. As the legal filings were transmitted, Noah's phone buzzed with a secure message from one of his former contacts inside the bureau. He read it once before his expression hardened. Rachel immediately knew something had changed. "What is it?" Noah slowly placed the phone on the table between them. "Victor Sloan just learned someone is challenging the evidence." Rachel felt the room grow impossibly quiet. "How?" Noah met her eyes. "Because there's still someone inside the justice system working for him." Rachel did not waste a single minute wondering who inside the justice system had betrayed them. The question no longer mattered as much as the clock. If Victor Sloan already knew the evidence was being challenged, he would either destroy what remained or force the case to trial before the truth could surface. Noah Grant immediately contacted the one federal judge he still trusted, Judge Eleanor Brooks, a woman whose reputation had been built over 3 decades on one unwavering principle: evidence should never fear politics. Within hours, she agreed to review the material under seal, allowing only a handful of authorized officials into a secure courtroom normally reserved for classified national security proceedings. No reporters were notified. No public docket announced the hearing. Even Damien's defense team received only enough information to appear without revealing why. Rachel carried the original flash drive into the courthouse herself, her hands steady despite everything that had happened. She had spent days protecting the identities of 12 innocent families, and now she finally had a way to separate their lives from the corruption hidden around them. Every witness relocation file had been removed from the presentation and replaced with sealed references that only the judge could examine privately. The forged memoranda, altered timelines, transportation records, metadata analysis, and original financial documents remained. Together, they formed a chain of evidence impossible to dismiss. When the hearing began, the courtroom felt strangely silent without television cameras or crowded public galleries. Damien entered wearing the same calm expression Rachel had seen on the courthouse steps days earlier, though the fatigue around his eyes revealed how little sleep prison had allowed him. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Neither smiled. Neither spoke. There would be time for emotions only if the truth survived. Judge Brooks listened patiently as Noah explained how the prosecution files had been altered after the original investigation had already begun. Rachel followed by demonstrating the impossible timeline created by the fabricated documents, carefully showing how legal filings referenced evidence that did not yet exist when the paperwork had supposedly been signed. Then came the metadata analysis. Every forged memorandum carried formatting standards adopted months after their claimed creation dates. The room fell silent as the judge compared the originals herself. Victor Sloan remained composed throughout the presentation, occasionally taking notes, occasionally whispering to his attorneys, but never interrupting. When his turn finally arrived, he dismissed the discrepancies as harmless administrative revisions, arguing that formatting changes occurred regularly within government offices and had no bearing on the substance of the case. For a brief moment, Rachel feared he might succeed. Then Judge Brooks asked a simple question: who authorized the revisions? Victor answered without hesitation: "My office did." "Can you identify the employee responsible?" He paused. Barely a second, but Rachel saw it. The smallest hesitation, the first genuine crack in the polished confidence that had protected him for years. Victor named a senior records administrator. Judge Brooks instructed the clerk to contact the employee immediately. The courtroom waited. 10 minutes later, the clerk quietly approached the bench and handed the judge a written note. Judge Brooks read it once before looking directly at Victor. "The employee you identified retired 11 months before these revisions were allegedly made." Silence spread across the courtroom like a wave. Victor's attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. One of them reached for a stack of files with noticeably less confidence than before. Rachel felt her heartbeat quicken, but Noah remained perfectly still. He knew the case had only begun to unravel. Judge Brooks ordered federal forensic specialists to examine every digital filing connected to the prosecution. Less than 2 hours later, preliminary findings confirmed unauthorized edits within the government's document management system. Access logs pointed not toward anonymous hackers or outside interference, but toward administrative credentials assigned to a special review office operating directly under Victor Sloan's authority. The courtroom atmosphere changed instantly. The prosecution that had entered with complete confidence now struggled to explain its own evidence. One assistant prosecutor quietly requested a recess. Another refused to answer the judge's questions without independent counsel present. Damien watched everything unfold without celebration. He understood that exposing corruption was not the same as restoring justice. Finally, Judge Brooks turned toward the lead federal prosecutor, who had remained unaware of the manipulation until that very morning. "Based on the evidence presented," she said evenly, "this court finds probable cause to believe material evidence was fabricated, altered, and knowingly submitted in support of criminal charges. The prosecution against Mr. Moretti is hereby suspended pending immediate independent review." A murmur swept through the room. Rachel closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in triumph but in relief. The witnesses remained protected. Damien was no longer facing a case built upon forged evidence. Yet before anyone could leave the courtroom, 2 agents from the Department of Justice's Office of Inspector General entered through the rear doors carrying official credentials. They walked directly toward Victor Sloan. One agent spoke quietly enough that only those nearest could hear. "Attorney General Sloan, we have a judicial authorization requiring your immediate cooperation regarding evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy." For the first time since Rachel had ever interviewed him, Victor Sloan looked genuinely surprised. He slowly rose from his chair, forcing a smile that no longer convinced anyone. As agents escorted him toward the exit, he stopped beside Rachel for only a heartbeat. His voice was almost calm. "You think you've won?" Rachel met his eyes without flinching. "No," she answered softly. "I think the truth finally caught up with you." Victor said nothing else. The courtroom doors closed behind him, leaving an extraordinary silence in their wake. Damien remained seated, watching Rachel across the room as though seeing her clearly for the first time since the nightmare had begun. He had entered the courthouse believing freedom depended on proving his innocence. Instead, he had witnessed his wife protect strangers, preserve justice, and save his life without sacrificing either. But even as the case against him collapsed, neither of them realized that one final decision still remained, the most personal one of all, because surviving the truth did not automatically heal the wounds it had left behind. 3 months after Victor Sloan was let out of the federal courthouse under criminal investigation, New York looked almost exactly the same. Yet nothing in Damien Moretti's life remained unchanged. Every charge against him had been formally dismissed after an independent review confirmed that key evidence had been fabricated and critical records had been manipulated before reaching the court. Several officials quietly resigned while others faced prosecution for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and abuse of public office. News networks that had once broadcast Damien's arrest around the clock now apologized in carefully worded segments, though none of those apologies could return the sleepless nights, the public humiliation, or the uncertainty that had settled over his family. Damien accepted every interview request with the same brief statement. "My freedom was restored because people chose truth over convenience. Remember their courage, not my name." He never criticized the reporters who had judged him too quickly, and he never claimed to be a victim. Rachel noticed that change more than anyone else. Before everything happened, Damien believed strength meant solving every problem himself. Now he understood that real strength sometimes meant trusting others to carry part of the burden. Their marriage, however, had not magically healed when the courtroom emptied. They had survived the conspiracy, but survival was different from recovery. Some evenings they sat together on the apartment balcony watching the city lights without speaking, not because they had nothing to say, but because silence no longer frightened them. It had become a place where honesty could grow instead of suspicion. One rainy afternoon, Rachel found Damien standing inside the small neighborhood bookstore where they had first met years earlier. He was holding the same history book they had both reached for on that ordinary Thursday that had quietly changed their lives. He smiled when she walked inside. "I borrowed it again," he said. Rachel looked at the worn cover and laughed softly. "You still think I'm going to let you have it first?" Damien shook his head. "No." He gently placed the book back onto the shelf between them. "I finally learned that some things are better shared." They wandered through the narrow aisles together until Damien stopped near the front window. The afternoon rain tapped softly against the glass. "There's something I need to say," he began. Rachel waited without interrupting. "When you refused to release the evidence, I thought I understood your choice." He took a slow breath. "I didn't, not completely. I understood it with my mind. It took losing everything before I understood it with my heart." Rachel reached for his hand but allowed him to continue. "You protected people neither of us had ever met. You protected the law when it failed you. And you protected me from becoming the kind of man who would save himself by sacrificing innocent lives." His voice faltered for the first time. "Thank you for loving me enough to let me hate your decision until I was ready to understand it." Rachel felt tears gather in her eyes. "I was terrified every single day," she admitted. "Not that you'd stop loving me, but that you'd stop believing in the woman you married." Damien smiled gently. "I never stopped believing in you." He looked down for a moment before adding with quiet honesty, "I just wasn't wise enough to understand you." They stood there as the rain continued falling outside, the years of fear, anger, and exhaustion slowly giving way to something steadier than happiness: peace. A few weeks later, Rachel received journalism's highest national award for her investigation into the conspiracy. The ceremony was held in a historic theater filled with reporters, judges, editors, students, and families who had followed the case from beginning to end. When Rachel walked onto the stage, the audience rose in applause that seemed to continue forever. She accepted the award with both hands, glanced briefly toward the front row, and found Damien sitting quietly beside Thomas Whitaker. No Grant, Margaret Ellis, and several of the witnesses whose identities had finally been protected through lawful court orders. They applauded not because she had exposed corruption, but because she had refused to abandon compassion while doing it. Rachel stepped to the microphone and looked across the crowded theater. "People often ask whether journalism is about exposing powerful people," she began. "It isn't. It's about protecting powerless people with the truth." The room fell completely silent. There were moments when telling the truth too quickly would have destroyed innocent lives. There were moments when silence felt unbearable. "I learned that integrity is not choosing between truth and kindness. It's refusing to sacrifice either." She paused, her eyes finding Damien once more. "This award belongs to everyone who believed justice should never come at the cost of humanity." When the ceremony ended, guests gathered around the stage, but Damien remained where he was, waiting until the crowd slowly disappeared. Rachel finally walked toward him, carrying the crystal award tucked beneath one arm. "You didn't come up for photographs," she said with a smile. Damien shook his head. "Tonight wasn't about me." Rachel looked at him for a long moment before quietly placing the award into his hands. "No," she whispered. "Tonight is about us." He looked surprised. "Why?" She smiled through tears that no longer came from fear. "Because years ago you told me you envied ordinary people. You said they could make mistakes without seeing them printed on the front page." Damien nodded, remembering every word. Rachel gently took his hand. "Maybe we were never meant to have an ordinary life." She intertwined her fingers with his. "But after everything we've survived, we can still have an honest one." Together they stepped out of the theater into the cool evening air. The city around them remained loud, restless, and imperfect, just as it had always been. Yet for the first time in a very long while, neither of them felt the need to outrun tomorrow. They simply walked side by side beneath the glowing streetlights, leaving behind a story that had begun with handcuffs and suspicion, but ended with something far more difficult to earn than freedom itself: the quiet certainty that love, when guided by truth and compassion, can survive even the darkest trial.